Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to the session. My name is Vilain, and I'm a pediatric geneticist at UCLA School of Medicine, and I also direct the Center for Gender-Based Biology that I will talk to you a little bit about. And my co-presenter is Dr. Cisco Sanchez, who's sitting to my right, and he's a psychology fellow in my lab. And we both work on the genetics of sexual development. So thanks for having us share our data this afternoon. I've been at this conference which started Thursday for a scientific part, and it was wonderful to see that a patient advocacy group was actually taking science so seriously and really wanted to involve doctors and clinicians and scientists to try to know more about those conditions. So thanks again. So today we're going to talk about the biology of sexual orientation and gender identity. I had a little laugh when I saw how it came out in the program. It sounded like it was going to be some kind of very bizarre session, but it's just not going to be that bad at all. You know, it's just not there was a lot of precautions, which I understand, but we're just going to tell you what we know, what we don't know about what triggers how we're and why we're attracted to other people, and it's really also the opportunity to discuss these issues. So. Today, what we're going to do is cover those 3 points. One, trying to provide you with a little bit of a primer of what we know about the biology of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I'll talk mostly about sexual orientation, and then Cisco Sanchez will talk about gender identity, and we'll discuss some basic genetic concepts related to complex behaviors, and finally we really want to provide a forum for discussion. So I think the session is supposed to be an hour and 15 minutes. We'll try to stop a little bit before an hour and to leave 15 minutes of discussion. However, if you have a burning question, please feel free to raise your hand. We work at UCLA, and there's a center at UCLA that's really devoted to understand the genetics of how sex is determined and how the development of the human reproductive system occurs at all levels, from the physical level to the behavioral level. So I'll start talking about sexual orientation, and as you all know, this is a topic that fascinates a lot of people, including the media. So there's always a lot of public interest on this matter, and it's also loaded with a lot of social consequences. The way in the current social debates, people thinking that. Sexual preferences, whether lifestyle choice or biologically driven, so we'll address that. What we're one of the reasons why we're studying sexual orientation is people often think that my lab works on finding the gay gene and only looking at having this sort of like very narrow view of understanding homosexuality. But that's not exactly the case. The reason why we're interested in the science of sexual orientation is because it is something that really concerns every human being, and it's really about understanding what makes people attracted to one another. And so the study of sexual orientation is not just the study of homosexuality; it's also the study of heterosexuality, and it's something that happens in the entire animal kingdom. So, what is sexual orientation? Well, sexual orientation is a complex trait, and it's a sexually dimorphic trait. So what does this mean? So sexually dimorphic means that it's different between males and females. What do I mean by this? I mean that males are, for the most part, about 95% of them, attracted to females. But females, for about 95% of them, are attracted to males. So the object of desire is vastly different between males and females. So in this sense, it is sexually dimorphic, meaning different between males and females. And it's extremely sexually dimorphic, in fact, because there is only a small overlap of about 5% of the population in which you're going to have males attracted to other males, just like females are. Complex, because this is a trait that's considered to be relatively common and often and presumably what controls sexual orientation. It's something that is going to involve lots of factors. Presumably more than one gene, and presumably with a lot of interactions with the environment. When I mean complex, I mean it in a genetic sense as opposed to a simple trait, which are considered to be rare traits caused by a single gene. So just to give you an example, avoiding to turn this into a genetic class, but you have a number of situations, whether pathologicals or just behavioral variants, in which you have one gene, so for example, that's causing the trait. So for instance, Huntington's disease, that's a very well-defined condition. It's rare, it's a neurodegenerative disorder, and we know one gene that causes it. And if you have a mutation in the gene, you're going to have Huntington's disease. If you don't, you're pretty safe. So that's clear-cut. What's a complex trait? Well, the example here would be attention deficit disorder. It's poorly defined. You never know what the boundaries of the syndrome is. It's relatively common. It's probably multigenic, meaning more than one gene, and there may be environmental causes, or at least the environment will certainly change the expression or how of the disorder. Okay, so how do we define our trait here, homosexuality? Well, like everything in science, we have to have tools to measure. And we do measure sexual orientation remarkably with scales that were invented and validated by Alfred Kinsey, a pioneer in sexology in the 40s. And we still use the Kinsey scales, measuring 4 parameters: attraction, fantasy, behavior, and self-identification. So they're slightly different parameters, but we ask questions about of those 4 parameters, and then the scale goes from 0 for exclusively attracted to the opposite sex in all those 4 parameters, to 6, which is exclusively attracted to same-sex partners in all 4 parameters. And you have, of course, the whole range in between. So if these Kinsey scores are applied to the general population, is there a no? Anyway, then what you observe is a difference in the distribution between males and females. You will see that in males, of course, zeros are, it goes through the roof because there is the vast majority of the population is, and here are the percentage. So there is about 95%, as I mentioned, of people going to be 0, meaning exclusively heterosexual. And depending on various studies to assess the frequency, about between 3 to 6% of almost exclusively homosexual. But what you see is that in males, the distribution is bimodal, meaning we see 2 peaks, and in between there is a very, very small number of people in between who I would qualify as bisexual, attracted to equally to both males and females. However, in women, the situation is a little different. The overall frequency of homosexuality is a little less, But there is a number of women who, across their lifespan, have had both experiences, heterosexual and homosexual. Okay, so there has been a number of theories on sexual orientation, and the field has been sort of heavily loaded with a number of non-biological theories that I'm not going to talk about, except just to introduce you to them and maybe try to debunk some of common ideas. There's the classic Freudian theory that's very environmental or familial. So it's your past experiences, mainly your parent, and this idea that if you have a dominant mother, or if your father is always away or weak, you have some kind of disruption of the Oedipal phase exit, and then you end up being an effeminate boy and gay. John Money had sort of expanded that to more social influence. Churchill was talking about the influence of past sexual experiences on during adolescence, and as it influences sexual orientation in adulthood. And then finally there's a whole school of social constructionism that basically says, well, gays and straight is just a society just constructs those labels, but they don't really exist. Now, every time there has been some scientific inquiry about those psychological theories, they've never been proven. And so every time it can be measured. So for instance, there's a number of theories about parental relationship. And this is something that you can actually measure. Questionnaires, you can look at divorced parents, you can look at a number of things, single moms, etc. If you do that, there is just no difference between the groups, between families with, say, single moms with a father away versus married couples or together in the rate of homosexuality in the children. Having unpleasant heterosexual experience or pleasant homosexual experiences does not influence your future sexual orientation. That has been looked at. There is no significant difference. There was also the idea that possibly sexual abuse in childhood may influence future sexual orientation. Again, if you actually look at the fact, not just look at listen to the radio, those studies show no difference. So that doesn't mean that there is no social influence, but every time a social influence has been tried to be demonstrated, it was a failure. So what I'll talk about today are the theories of sexual orientations that are biological theories. And I'll go through three different things. The hormones, association studies, and I'll tell you what that is in a minute, and the genes. Okay, so let's start with hormones, because in biology, hormones have been thought to influence sexual behavior for a very long time. Most of these studies on sexual orientation have been done on animal models. That's really been the basis of why scientists think that hormones influence sexual behavior. And what people have done is, I'll come to that, is do things such as some modifications. I have to have a silly animation here. So, either there was a knife that kind of flew down. So you castrate the male, or you inject the female with a masculinizing agent. So you can manipulate. That's a good thing with animal models. You can try to change the levels of hormones and see what happens if you give a masculinizing agent to an XX rat in this case, and what happens if you do that, or you can castrate the male and see what happens. And so in this picture, and the rat, you can look at the sexual behavior. So the females typically have this posture that's called lordosis before they receive the male, and the male has this posture called mounting. And you can actually quantify this and measure it. Now in this picture, the mounting rat is a female that's been injected with masculinizing hormones, and down there is a male that has been castrated. So you can reverse the sexual behavior of these animals. However, this is what I consider a relatively poor marker of sexual orientation, because it's not as if you change the sexual preference of a male from mounting a female to wanting to mount a male. What you change is the entire behavior of the males. As the males become suddenly entirely receptive to other males. You cannot get, with variations of hormone, a male to mount other males. The other point is that those hormonal manipulations are pharmacological doses, very high doses of hormones, and they're far beyond naturally occurring variations. So in humans, there is only a small degree of evidence that hormones play a role in sexual orientation. And this evidence is limited to females, to women, to girls and women. And this evidence comes from a particular number of intersex cases named CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is a condition in which the XX fetuses is, because of the genetic condition, resulting in a high excess of androgens produced by the adrenals of the fetus. Those XX fetuses are bathed into massive amounts of testosterone, and so much that their genitals become virilized. But when you actually assess their sexual behavior, there is an increased number of lesbian women, and there is also an increased number of girls who have gender nonconformity, meaning that they would have, in terms of toy preference or all sorts of behaviors, they would have a more masculine type of behavior. So the summary of the hormonal studies is the following. As I mentioned, it's only gross hormonal abnormalities or manipulation that affect sexual orientation. There is so far no evidence that small variations actually influence sexual orientation. There's been a number of molecular and genetic studies looking at variations of androgen receptor or aromatase that show no effect of sexual orientation. And these effects of hormones are limited only to a small subset of women. So it's in men, having less testosterone has never been shown to influence sexual orientation. So it's an important point. So it's only the excess of androgens in women. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about association studies, and what that means is that when something is complicated in science and when we don't really know what to look at, or when, for instance, we have a hypothesis that's hormones and it's really, the result doesn't pan out that well, what scientists do is look at things that co-vary, meaning if you have a particular trait, say, in this case, a sexual orientation that's homosexual, are there other things that happen at the same time with high frequency? Is there something that we can correlate with this trait systematically? So there's been a number of features that have been looked at. For instance, and some of these studies seem a little weird at the beginning, because it's just like, why on earth would people do that? But just bear with me. So if you look at, if you measure systematically the length of your fingers, the ratio between the index finger and the ring finger, which we call 2D40, so second digit and fourth digit, is actually a sexually dimorphic trait. In men, the fourth digit is slightly longer than the second digit, whereas in women it's about the same size, or at least it's not as different. Okay, so that's a known finding. The biological reason for this is not very clear. Possibly the fourth digit would be more sensitive to androgens, which to me doesn't make any sense, but we don't know the cause. Now, people have looked at this and to ask whether, for instance, lesbian women would have a different 2D/4D ratio. And some studies have said yes, they do, and some studies have said no, they don't. So we are still unclear here. People have looked at also transsexuals, male to female transsexuals, and female to male transsexuals. So the 2D4, the finger length ratio was found to be more feminized than men in both cases of male to females and female to males, which just doesn't make much sense. I'm just telling you all the data. I'm not saying that I make sense of them. And people have also looked at children and adults with gender identity disorder, and in these cases only the women were found to differ significantly from control. So, you know, there might be something going on, some correlation with a finger length ratio that we've not much idea how it works. So, can we recognize homosexuals by their hands? The answer is, even if there was an effect, you can't go around and look at the fourth digit and say, "Haha, I know." In fact, you know, the largest studies show no effect of sexual orientation. So there's a number of small studies that show an effect, and a large study that show no effect once you control for ethnicity. So, bottom line of this, I just think there is a lack of evidence. But if you go on Google and you put finger length ratio and homosexuality, you'll find thousands and thousands of hits. People have looked at a number of other things. Fingerprint asymmetry. Gay men are supposed to have an asymmetry of their fingerprint. Age of puberty. They're supposed to have later puberty. Autoacoustic emission, which is, you know, we all hear things in our ears, but our tympanic membrane actually vibrates and does emit some kind of ultrasounds. That's called autoacoustic emission. It's actually different between males and females. People have looked if it was also different with gays. Result, no consistent results. There's a number of studies, but every time it tries to be replicated, it's a failure. Now, let's talk about things that have been replicated. Handedness. That's been replicated in very, very large samples, and that's scientifically, quote-unquote, true, as in it can be replicated and it has a statistical significance. So gay men have about 34% higher odds of being non-right-handed, and lesbian women 91% higher odds of being non-right-handed. So it's not that non-right-handed, it's kind of the politically correct term for left-handed, but it just means that you're either right-handed or a lot of people who are left-handed, they're either left-handed occasionally or ambidextrous, or so it's. But so in other words, here, and that's the same thing for male to female and female to male transsexuals. So there is, and for boys with gender identity disorders. So there is a strong association of handedness and sexual orientation. Now, keep in mind that, again, you know, if you walk around and you see someone who's left-handed, that doesn't mean this person is gay. You know, a non-right-handed man or woman is most likely to be heterosexual. The reason is because you have to remember the baseline of homosexuality. That's, say, to simplify, about 5%. So if you have a 34% higher odds to be non-right-handed, you know, in the population of left-handed, this proportion will go from 5% to about 7%. So and maybe to 10% in women. It's still small. Okay. Another bizarre yet real association is fraternal birth order effect. Gay men, but not women, tend to have more older brothers but not sisters. And each older brother increases the odds of male homosexuality by about a third. Now, you can say, well, that's just, crazy talk. If you just look at families, that's what happens. There may be some biological explanation. However, that's just what happens. Again, remember that increasing the odds of homosexuality by 33% increases your baseline for 5% to, at the first older brother, to about 7%. The second older brother, you add 33%. It would take about a family of 10 older brothers to maybe have a 50-50 chance. Okay. So, in these studies, and there have been numerous, only the biological older brothers matter. So if it's been adopted at even a very young age, the effect doesn't work. It's only true for right-handed gay men. I don't know why, but it hints at something biological. The hypothesis behind that is that there would be some kind of an immune reaction from the mother's womb, if you will. And the idea would be that every time there is a male pregnancy, the mother does produce some antibodies, or some immune response against the foreign body that would be the male fetus. There would be some male-specific antibodies. So the idea is that with successive male pregnancies, there would be some kind of a boost effect, just like think of it as a vaccine. And so after a number of pregnancies, this effect would be so strong against male antigens that it would actually feminize the fetus. It's purely hypothetical at this point, but that's a possible biological explanation. The final association I want to talk about is childhood gender nonconformity. What is it? It's a sex atypical behavior. I'll show you an example in a second. And the idea is that, and if you look at children, like these two children, this little boy up there and this little girl down there, behave in a sex atypical manner, as in they want to dress up like with the opposite sex. They also are more interested in playing with opposite sex peers. So little boys, when they're gender conforming, play with other boys. They never want to deal with girls when they're 5 or 6 or 7. But these kids do play with the opposite sex, or tomboyish girl do play with boys. I'm sorry, with girls rather than tomboyish girls would play with boys rather than gender-conforming girls. Now, when young children are very gender non-conforming, a very large percentage of them do become gay men when they're boys. And it's probably true for girls who are very tomboyish. Now, that doesn't mean that out of all the adult gay population, they were all like this. We don't know what percentage of adult gay men were gender conforming as boys. But when there is gender nonconformity in childhood, it's a good predictor of sexual orientation. So I'll just show you a little example of this. How do I do that?
Military toys. These bedrooms belong to twins who are 9 years old. One room is all camouflage, airplanes, and military toys. The other, well, see for yourself. A pastel canopy, stuffed animals, white horses. Not all that surprising for boy-girl twins. Except these twins are Jared and Adam.
I have the Marines parking only.
When I came for a visit, Jared was eager to show me his G.I. Joe collection.
I have ones that say like Marine and SWAT, and then that's where I keep all the guns for them.
Adam, on the other hand...
This is one of my dolls. Rat's baby. This is made by the company that made this and this.
I hate to interrupt you, but I just noticed You have nail polish on with stars.
And diamonds.
And diamonds. I have to ask you a question. Did you go to school like that today?
I just showed them my nails and they were like, why did you do that?
Adam's behavior is called childhood gender nonconformity, meaning a child whose interests and behaviors are more typical of the opposite sex. Research shows that kids with extreme gender nonconformity usually grow up to be gay. Michael Bailey, a psychologist.
So, it was just to show you an example of childhood gender nonconformity, so that you get an idea. And this is a behavior, as I mentioned, that's highly predictive of future sexual orientation. Okay, and another, and we're getting like more into the anatomy now. Another association with sexual orientation is the way the brain is shaped. And there are some structures in the brain that are known to be sexually dimorphic, again, meaning different between males and females. And this is the case for a small nucleus in the brain that's called the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, and which is larger in males, smaller in females. And when it was looked by Simon Levay in gay men, it was found that this particular nucleus was smaller, therefore more female-sized, if you will. So there is some evidence that there are structural differences in the brain that are associated with sexual orientation. This finding was replicated not only in humans, but it was replicated in. I'm sorry. First of all, this first study in humans remains somewhat controversial. Because the attempt to replicate it were, shall I say, borderline. However, attempts to replicate it in animal models of sexual orientation showed that there was also differences in sizes in the same region of the brain. Comparing, in this case, this is a sheep model, and in the sheep population, you may not realize, but about 8% of rams are actually male-oriented. And so, if someone tells you that homosexuality does not exist in nature, there is a whole scientific evidence that shows that in the ram population there is about 8% of them that are oriented sexually towards other males. And if you look at what happens in their brains, they actually do show a difference in the same nucleus in the hypothalamus as gay men. Okay. So that's it for all the association studies, and I'll finish my part with the roles of genes. And the main reason why scientists think that there is a genetic basis for sexual orientation comes from twin studies. And twin studies are a very well-established way to show how much sort of genetic influence there is for a particular trait or disease or what have you. And what you do is you compare monozygotic twins, meaning identical twins, to dizygotic twins, meaning fraternal twins. And if you do that, what you're expecting is that if the genes influence sexual orientation, the concordance rate for homosexuality should be higher in identical twins than in fraternal twins. The reason is the following, is that if a trait is heavily influenced by genetics, you're more likely to have, if one twin has a particular trait, the co-twin will have the same trait, the same trait, if it's highly heritable, because they have the exact same genetic background, if they're identical. However, if they're fraternal, the concordance rate is going to be lower. And that's exactly what happens for sexual orientation, in which the concordance rate in monozygotic, that is, identical twins, is about 50%. But in fraternal twins, it's only 22%. So concordance rate means that if one twin is gay, the chance for the identical twin to be gay is also 50%. But if the chance for the fraternal twin to be gay is only 20%. So now you can say, well, why isn't it 100% in the identical twin? And there are a number of possible explanations for that that I don't have time to go into. But it leaves certainly open the door for some social or environmental causes. But the difference between those two percentages proves that there is a genetic component. Now, genetic component, so where is it? Well, another evidence that there is genetic causes to sexual orientation is looking at families. So that's how geneticists look at families. It's just like little, circles for women and square for men. And here, in solid yellow, those are families in which there is more than one gay man. And there is what we call maternal loading, meaning that there is more chance to have more gay men on the maternal side. So for instance, in the maternal uncle or maternal cousin. So what you can do is you can do what we call a linkage analysis, and what we show some association that's been shown by Dean Hamer in the mid-90s at the NIH, that there is a particular region of the X chromosome that's systematically different in the gay man when there is a family with more than one case of homosexuality. And this region is on chromosome X, on the long arm of the X, on XQ28. Now, these studies have been going on in the mid-90s. We're now almost at the end of the 2000s, and we still don't know where the gene is. For a variety of reasons. There's not much funding to do these studies. There's not much interest in a lot of scientists. In addition, this region of the X chromosome is particularly gene dense and complex. And also, we have no idea what we're looking for. What would this gene do? And one way we've looked at it, saying, well, if there's something in the X chromosome, we've looked at it again in collaboration with Dean Hamer and with and Sven Bachland, who was a postdoc in my lab, was with Dean Hamer at the time, and you might have seen him at our booth yesterday. We said, well, maybe there is something going on in the way the X chromosome behaves. And one thing about the X chromosome, as you may know, is that in women, one of the X chromosome gets inactivated to kind of avoid this extra dose of this extra X chromosome. As you know, in Klinefelter syndrome, XXY, the extra X chromosome is also inactivated with only a small number of genes that escape this inactivation. And here's a picture of a calico cat, because that's why if you see calico cats with more than two colors, you pretty much are sure that these cats are actually female because there's a random pattern of X inactivation. Interestingly, in the scientific literature, maybe some of you know that there's a few examples of male cats who are calico, and if you do the karyotype, they're actually XXY. So anyway, when we looked at the way the X chromosome is inactivated in the mothers of gay men, and I won't go into the details of this study, but the idea is that, and just focus, normally you have random X inactivation, like on top of those are mothers of straight men. And if you have mothers of two or more gay sons, one of their X chromosome gets sort of highly skewed. It's always one X chromosome that gets inactivated rather than the other one. We don't know why, but that just reinforces the idea that something's going on in the X chromosome. You might have seen our booth and trying to recruit some of you, some of the XXY males and XXYY males. And what I just wanted to, and that's my last slide before we talk about gender identity briefly, is what we've been doing is actually following up on this idea that something is going on the X chromosome that somehow could influence sexual orientation. And the idea is that instead of looking at the mothers, which we have to do for gay men or XY where there is no X inactivation, is look at individuals who have more than one X, in which we can actually look at X inactivation pattern, and we can compare the X inactivation profile between gay and straight XXY males. We can also look at the influence of the parent of origin of the X chromosome. The last thing I want to say about the subject, and it may come into questions, is that there is no epidemiological data on the frequency of homosexuality in sex chromosome trisomies. Along these conferences, I've had these questions asked in many forms, many times. Is there, some people say there is an excess of gay men in XXY. Some people say that is not true. The reality is we don't know. I just wanted to point this before going to the last subject, which is the biology of gender identity.
So I'll try to get through my part here in about 15 minutes so we leave time for questions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how biology may influence our sense of being male or female. And before I get into the actual biological studies, which are not very many, I just wanted to start out with some of the more sociological aspects, because certainly it's kind of a conversation or a topic that's talked a lot about in public, about the differences between men and women and why are they so different. So things from popular books such as, men are from Mars and women are from Venus, the idea that they can't communicate with each other because they're just so different, or even from kind of jokes about if we take a man and a woman shopping at a mall and we give them a mission to go buy a pair of jeans and we follow their pattern, the red being the woman has visited almost every store where she got to the Gap, actually, and the male went straight to the Gap. Female took about 3 hours and 26 minutes and spent $876, and she actually never even got to the Gap, by the way. Whereas the male, 6 minutes, $33. So certainly these kind of market differences people may look at. But certainly when it comes to like mental health issues, also noticing some kind of patterns of different occurrences. So for instance, if you look at sociopathic behavior, for whatever reason, we see that men tend to exhibit these much more than women. And certainly if you look at all the school shootings, I can't think of any that was perpetrated by a female in the U.S. And if we look at mood disorders or the occurrence of depression, for whatever reason, women tend to be diagnosed much more with that than men. But aside from these, why is it and how is it that these differences come to be and what contributes to them? And so certainly from a sociological point of view, a lot of different factors will affect why is it that women and girls may like certain kind of behaviors, like talking on the phone all the time, maybe shopping a lot. Why is it that boys may like more rough and tumble play, watching sports, playing with guns? And of course, people will say, well, it's because they're socialized into those roles, and so this would be extreme forms of that, where a girl has everything pink in her room and a boy has everything blue. And how these kind of messages from the environment begin really from the time of birth, when people are given pink or blue in the crib. So from a social constructionist point of view, it is these kind of things that is making men and women different. And some terms that you'll come across, and we'll use these a lot. So gender identity being our sense of being a man or a woman, which typically reflects the birth sex we were given at birth. Gender roles being patterns of behaviors that are ascribed to either men or women. Masculine, feminine being the common label given for the behaviors that are typical of males versus typical of female. And then gender constancy, this notion that from a very early age, children tend to adopt a gender identity that reflects their birth sex, and that once this has been adopted, it will remain constant throughout life. Now, the thing to say about when we talk about these differences is to understand that really behavior isn't that simple, so it isn't an all or none, or black or white issue. But instead, when we measure traits, let's say we want to measure men's ability to listen, for instance, and maybe listen to his female partners, there may be, the average may be in the middle, and some may be really good listeners on the right side of this distribution, and some may be really bad listeners here on the left side. All right, so there's variation within groups. But most men may be more towards the center, known as 68% within the standard deviation. And we'll compare two groups, and of course, in this case, we'll measure men and women, and there is considerable overlap. And so, understanding that yes, maybe on average, men may not be as good listeners, but that there is a lot of men who are maybe better listeners than the average woman, and some women who are worse listeners than the average man. All right, so just the idea that anytime you hear these kind of studies, always wondering, well, how much of an overlap is it when they talk about people being so different? I should hold this. So the main idea for social construction, the idea being that it is these societal influences that really come about men and women that end up influencing our sense of gender, and these schemas that we develop that make us decide how we're going to live our lives. And that this schema and this identity then in turn affects how we view other people, how we process information about people's behavior, and at the same time influences how we feel about ourselves. If we feel we're not man enough, we're not woman enough, we violate some kind of role. And so that those schemas affect, which came from society, affect how we view ourselves. But from our point of view, what we want to know, okay, we accept that yes, in fact, the environment does influence us, but may there also be some kind of biological influence on our sense of being a man or a woman? And the one approach that we've taken to study this trait has been to look at a group of individuals who deviates or who is really outside of the typical range we expect for men, and that being transsexuals. And transsexuals being individuals who, for whatever reason, report feeling like the opposite sex, like they're a woman trapped in a man's body, and who will take a lot of steps to alter their body through hormones and through surgery in order for that body to reflect their sense of gender. And just to avoid confusion, it's not transvestite or drag queens or kings, people who may cross-dress for entertainment reasons, but people who really want to alter their sex. And in the popular culture, of course, we have recently seen more and more of this topic being addressed through popular films such as Transamerica, which has some Academy Awards attached to it. But even on television, which popular shows such as Ugly Betty on ABC, which one of the main characters, Alexis Bean, is actually a male or female transsexual. So again, more awareness on the popular culture about transsexual women, but the degree to which they necessarily reflect the reality is up for debate. So a lot of different terms we may encounter before I talk about the research, just to kind of go through what exactly some of the main terms may be. So when it comes to transgender, understanding again that this is a really generic term for individuals who are outside of who differ from, in their gender expression, from what would be expected for the sex that was assigned to them at birth. So it could be transsexuals, it could be cross-dressers, it could be drag queens, drag kings, people who call themselves genderqueer, some people who identify as intersex identify with the transgender community as well. Again, transsexual being individuals who wish to live as the opposite sex and will take a lot of steps to do that. And you may see these little acronyms a lot, MTF, meaning someone who's male who wishes to transition to female, and FTM, female to male. And again, these are usually interchangeably used with transvestite, but transvestite really are people who cross-dress for a variety of reasons, but typically these are heterosexual men who do it just because it's part of a sexual fantasy or fetish. So. And understand also there are regional uses of terms, so how terms that are maybe acceptable here in the US within the transgender community may not be as acceptable in other parts of the world. So maybe tranny is offensive here, but not in England, but in England transy is offensive, where here transy is not effective. So just understand that there's a lot of labels, a lot of terms out there for this. At any rate, Dr. Vilain just talked about sexual orientation, but just wanted to be clear that our sense of being male or female is distinct from our sexual attraction. So whenever we study these, we try to measure both of these and not just assume one because of the other. They may be correlated, but again, we treat these as individual traits. And I would kind of go in the same order as Dr. Vilain. So hormonal influences, again, there isn't very much biological research on what makes us feel like men or women. But a lot of early studies, again, trying to say that it's because of hormone levels. But when we look at individuals at baseline before they get any kind of treatment, who identify as transsexual, their hormone levels are within the expected range for their birth sex. And that's been replicated several times. As well as people trying to get it to say that it's because of different doses of hormones that would reflect gender identity. But as Dr. Vilain said, really this only measures behavior, and we have no idea what the mice are thinking or any animal that's been manipulated. All right, association studies. He went through a lot of association studies, and again, these have tried to be replicated within transsexuals, showing that those transsexuals who transition, usually around adolescence, tend to have more older brothers, and those who, there's another group that tends to transition at midlife. For whatever reason, there's that pattern there. And with finger-length ratio, really not many consistent findings with adults. There may be some findings among children. All right, brain sex. So if we look at just men and women who do not have a transgender identity, we see that there are many differences between men and women. Women typically have much more gray matter than men do, a lot more cortical thickness, a lot of different neuroanatomical parameters where women are always much bigger than men in terms of their brains. But an interesting study came out in the mid-90s looking at the autopsy brains of transsexuals to see whether or not any differences could be found for those who are transsexual and how would they compare to men and women. And a particular region of the brain was found to be different. And so if we look at this, the BNST, heterosexual men and homosexual men look pretty similar in their density, whereas heterosexual women and male and female transsexuals look different than the men who are congruent in their gender identity. And so a lot of people would say, well, this is perhaps evidence that there is a neuroanatomical reason for gender identity in these women. The problem with these kind of studies is that in this case it was a study of 6 brains which had been autopsied, and these women had been treated for many years with estrogen, which has been shown to influence the shape of the brain after they begin treatment. So it's an interesting finding, but we really don't know what was found. A few other studies again, so hormones do seem to alter the brain after women are being, or male or female transsexuals are being treated. A few other studies finding that for whatever reason, when we expose male and female transsexuals a certain sense, they seem to respond the way we see women respond, and very differently than men or gay, heterosexual or gay men. And when they're being exposed to visual stimuli, so things like new pictures, their response to them is not like heterosexual men or homosexual men, but more like women. But again, we don't really know what to make these studies. These are very early studies. We had our own study, which was trying to look at women who had not yet been treated with hormones, so that we tried to keep that confound out to see if we could find any differences. And in our study, we were only able to find a small region, which is in this bottom slide, where transsexual women were more similar to females than males in the putamen. But again, these are very early studies, and we're just now starting to explore these. And finally, genetic influence. Trying to see, may there be any kind of pattern, any kind of genetic variation that's influencing gender identity. Again, these studies are very early, but again, there's very few family case studies, so we can't really follow it with the pedigrees that Dr. Vilain showed you. This being an assortment of cases found in one report, but again, very different expressions of gender identity, so we can't necessarily follow those. When it comes to looking at some chromosomal regions, looking at many different regions that were found to be somewhat different, but the most common was in disomy Y. Again, in these cases, they're open to interpretation. They need to be followed up, as is in the case of many different candidate genes that were argued to be influencing this. So for instance, the first gene at the top being one necessary to help masculinize the brain, maybe some variations were found there in the sample of male and female transsexuals. Another gene important in converting testosterone into DHT, not found to influence, but a different gene in charge of estrogen and progesterone concentrations. There seemed to be an association of female to male, but not male to female transsexuals. So again, we don't really know the biology at this point. There may be a biological basis for transsexualism, which we can hope maybe use as a model then to extend it to men and women's regular identity and see how it fits within this kind of scheme again. The idea that it's only society that influences our gender identity, where we want to see, well, to what degree does biology, is it related to these constructs and in turn affect gender schemes? So, all right, that's all I have. So we are now open for any questions you may have for either party, either for Dr. Vilain or myself.
comments or
comments, discussion, disagreements?
Yep.
So basically you're saying they don't know.
It depends for what. We don't. It depends for what. No, that's not what we. No. For sexual orientation, I mean, there is all sorts of levels of knowledge. We know that sexual orientation has a strong genetic influence. We know that in women there is a hormonal influence, although it's limited. We just don't know which gene. We also know that there is something in the X chromosome. We just don't know exactly what the molecular mechanisms are. So it's some knowledge. It's not the entire knowledge, but it is. It's still. I think it's still pretty good. Now for gender identity, however, you're right. We know very little, and and the degree to which gender identity is socially influenced versus biologically influenced remains very fuzzy because a lot of the studies contradict each other. So we know quite a bit in sexual orientation, very little in gender identity. Right. So they
weren't influenced by the environment.
Right.
It was just part of them.
Right. So it confirms that. So that goes in the direction of that there is scientific evidence for a genetic influence. Absolutely. But you say that now. If you say that to a number of people, they would say, well, that is not true. This is still society. Maybe the parents educated them differently, etc., etc. Just having, but yeah. So what you've heard from friends or relative or whatever goes in the same direction of an early biological influence.
Well, I know one in particular that was raised in a household to be heterosexual, and he ended up not being heterosexual.
Right.
Yeah, so I know that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what you're saying is that there might be a gene that expresses itself on the X chromosome that might express itself more towards homosexuality.
Well, you have to think of those genes as genes to be attracted to men or genes to be attracted to women. I never like to think of it as gay gene versus straight gene because it's better to think of it as there are genes that make people attracted to men, and those genes are presumably turned on at a high level in women. You can imagine that those same genes, which normally are repressed or turned down or not expressed in males, well, for a small percentage of the population, they remain turned on. It's the same gene. It's not as if there is this one gay gene that's only there or only has a specific mutation or something like this only in gay men. It's going to be the same genetic mechanisms that make women attracted to men that also makes a small population of men also attracted to men. Yeah.
Well, there's been a very famous recent example of, I think you would call it transsexual, where Chastity Bono has decided that she's male,
Right.
and she's going through all of the procedures to become male. And now that's transsexual, and that's
Right.
the identity. So she's
Right.
believed forever that she was really a boy. She used to do the non-conforming.
Well, I don't know if she believed forever that she was a boy. She was certainly tomboyish earlier. It was a developmental process that at some point she was a man. And yeah, so she now qualifies, quote unquote, as a transsexual. Yeah. Yep.
Let's see, did I understand correctly? I got confused later, so I want to make sure I understood this
Sure.
earlier. I think you said we don't know if more men with XXY are gay. Did you say that?
Correct.
And are you studying years now that you think will lead to more information on that?
Well, what we've been doing this conference will absolutely not answer this question of frequency. No, the study we're doing will answer will hopefully answer questions of the role of the X chromosome on sexual orientation. Now, ascertaining the frequency of homosexuality in the general population is already difficult, but in small groups of with a particular trait, like Klinefelter, for instance, is even harder because of the way the support groups are structured. You know, if it's support groups that really favor the integration of individuals with sexual variations, then not so you could say, well, that's great, but if it actually could attract more gay men than in other settings, or conversely, if it's a setting that's, say, extremely conservative and doesn't want to deal with gay men, then they're not going to be part of it. So you really need, I would say, to answer this question, we would need some kind of a cohort that's without a bias of ascertainment in the general population, say. And we talked about this a little bit in the scientific meeting before. And that's a cohort that's not just to address sexual orientation, but to address all the other issues of really what are, say, the behavioral problems, the learning disability. What's the percentage of this? Are we just seeing are we just reporting an extreme of the spectrum, or what's the reality? So if there was a cohort of, say, a population of, I don't know, 100 or 200,000 individuals, out of which presumably there would be 100 or 200 Klinefelters, then we could actually follow them and then start figuring out something without bias of ascertainment. Okay. Oh, there's a question in the back. Yep.
Did you see the primetime news, primetime show last week about the gentleman who was born Klinefelters, and then he was gay, or he felt he was married, but he felt gay, and then he had a bee sting that seemed to change his hormonal makeup, and all of a sudden his features became more feminine, and then he ultimately had surgery to become a woman.
So he had a what? He had
A bee sting.
Oh, bee sting. A bee sting. Oh, I see.
He was allergic to bees.
Okay.
And supposedly it did something to his hormones. Yeah. He was mosaic, XXY.
So you know, I was out of the country last week, so it's a good thing, I suppose. No, that's, you know, there are lots of bizarre stories like this, and it's I mean, my comment is, you know, if bee stings turned you transsexuals, we would know about it, you know, because there are many more people with bee stings than transsexuals. So, you know, those things, you know, what happens is, for all sorts of social reasons, and I really want to, I think it's a reflection of how society is really it's a harsh environment for a lot of people with sexual variations. In particular, transsexual society it's very difficult to be accepted in our society. That's very in many ways conservative and somehow separate the sexes and so forth. I mean, you know, when a transsexual goes down the street, you know, everyone notices it and people comment, and it's hard for them to find jobs or to change sex on the job. There's all sorts of social problems, and a lot of people in the transsexual community believe that having some kind of biological explanation will help them socially, or maybe they just don't want to say, well, I really had those feelings before, so you have to find some kind of an excuse or some kind of a way to explain it. And that's how I interpret those, rather than giving credence to these things. Yep.
In the transsexual population, is there more male to female or female to male? Or?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and although, you know, again, as usual, when assessing frequencies is hard, and a number of activist groups think that the frequency of transsexualism is much higher than what's reported in the medical literature. However, in the medical literature, frequency of male to female transsexualism is quoted at about 1 in 10,000.
So no formal studies have been done in the United States. And the American Psychiatric Association, in their book, the prevalence is 1 in 30,000 for male to female, and about 1 in 100,000 for female to male. However, there's a lot of reports out of the Netherlands, out of South Asian countries, where the frequencies are much higher than that, as high as 1 in almost 3,000 for male to females in Southeast Asia.
But the bottom line is male to females seems to be more frequent than female to males, to answer your question. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention.